Hello, class. This is a review of Chapter 23 from your textbook on progressivism. So, Carnegie um, traveled across the country. He paid for the construction of 7,000 church organs across the country. These are those really ornate church organs. He donated a large amount of money to the Tuskegee Institute, an African American college, which we covered a few weeks ago. He wrote this book, the autobiography of Andrew Carnegie, and his essay, The Gospel of Wealth. And in this book, which was well sold, he asked rich to use their money to improve society and to improve the world. He and Jane Addams, another noted progressive of the era, were strong supporters of democracy, and both were anti-war. Carnegie also helped build about 3,000 libraries, many of which still exist today. So I think it's safe to say he's an example of a non-government progressive of the era. This next slide is of Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was a progressive and very well known in politics of the time in the late 1890s. He was born in 1858 and died in 1919, and his childhood of asthma really affected his outlook on life. He became interested in the outdoors, rode horses, weightlifted, hunted, traveled. And because of his interest in the outdoors, he later pushed for laws protecting land and wildlife. Um, he then went into politics in the New York State Assembly and strongly pushed for reform and anti-corruption in the New York Police Department. He became known as a soldier in the Spanish-American War, but after the war, he went into politics and eventually became governor of New York and vice president to Republican McKinley. Um, so McKinley, who was a traditional Republican, was assassinated in 1901, and Theodore Roosevelt, also a Republican but very progressive as a Republican, became president in much of an unplanned way in 1901. As president, Theodore Roosevelt became a strong supporter of women's rights and the right for women to vote. He became immediately friends with Booker T. Washington, um, the fellow who had wrote Up for Slavery and had became a close friend of Roosevelt. Uh, Importantly, Roosevelt, as a progressive and really the leader of the progressives at that time, worked to protect over 200 million acres of national forests. So much of the national forests we have today is a result of that. Um, so after taking a break and not running for reelection right away, he took a 4-year break. He ran for reelection again in 1912, but not as a Republican. The Republican Party nominated um, someone else, and Roosevelt ran in his own party uh, called the Bull Moose Progressives. That if you have the textbook, you can look that up. Theodore Roosevelt was very much a conservationist. You can see him here standing by a national forest. He spent much of his time outdoors. He loved to fish, hunt, travel, even box, and so he had a great respect for nature. And much of his square deal plan was to keep the national forest protected, and he played a very large role in creating and protecting many different national forests. And then at later times, you had other presidents protecting national forests, and then of course the states with state forests, which was essential that development not destroy many of these areas. Okay, so Theodore Roosevelt's Square Deal is what was the coin name of his idea, the Square Deal. And to summarize some of the major points of that, he wanted to control corporate abuses, monopolies, um, unfair conditions for workers. The second part of it was conservation of natural resources. The third was consumer protection uh, in things such as food and safe prescription drugs and other safety things for consumers. Um, he also supported safety measures for workers, including sea workers, which had few before him, and in general wanted to rein in abuses by big business and try to have a level playing field between the workers and the owners, like he would call it. Um, he would call it a square deal for Americans and workers. And then finally, to have pure food and drugs. And obviously, since Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, there was even more attention made towards problems with the safety of food. So these were all part of what he called the square deal. Another big issue under the progressives was the ending of child labor. You see our picture of children protesting, holding signs, we ask for justice, we want to go to school. This certainly was one of the largest issues of that era, as we covered earlier, even with the Breaker Boys. And eventually, some laws were passed to protect children with child labor. Part of that was with compulsory education, um, and other laws limiting the types of work that children would do. There was some progress made both under Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson in this area, but some of that would still remain even for another 10 years. Another type of progressive who was not in government, but he was a writer of the era, was John Muir. He was a Scottish American naturalist who had been born in 1838 and died in 1914. Mainly, he was a nature activist. He wrote many books about his travels. He created the Sierra Club Conservation Organization, which pushed for laws protecting nature. Even today, his club still exists. The name of Muir's club is the Sierra Club, and it's still larger than ever at this point. So, in general, progressives of all types, political, conservation, businessmen, these are some of the things they believed in. Eliminating corruption, reforming education, supporting the women's right to vote, being against child labor, laws for worker safety, a professionalized education and social work. Remember Jane Addams, who was the founder of social work. And then fighting for purity of food, milk, and drinking water were all strong goals in the progressive era. This era lasted from 1890 to 1920, basically ended after World War One. Henry Ford was a businessman in the era, um, and in some ways, even though he may not have said it himself, but he was progressive in the sense that he paid his workers about double any other car company, and he did that without any government pressure. He just did that on his own. He gave his workers twice the benefits of other workers in the auto industry. And for that reason, he was more skilled laborers wanted to work for him than at any other company. And this was at the time when he invented um, assembly lines and quick production of automobiles, and was really one of the first people to invent cars, and certainly to invent mass production of cars. Here's one more shot of him by an invented car. Um, he became the most famous inventor of cars in the era, and his Model T sold millions and millions of cars and revolutionized America, as well as having the highest paid workers and happiest workers. So President Woodrow Wilson, um, the Democrat from 1912 to 1920, also was a progressive and a progressive Democrat. And he had a very rare background for a president. He had been a dean and a president of a university of Princeton, and then eventually changed his career and eventually became president. And as a progressive, he was committed to ending child labor, and part of that was with the Keaton-Owens Child Labor Act. Um, and then workers' compensation law for injuries, the 9-hour workday for federal employees, and the 8-hour workday for railroad workers. So um, these were all part of his progressive ideas. And also a strong part that differed between some progressives, but Woodrow Wilson, as a progressive, was strongly anti-war and wanted to keep out of foreign wars, and then especially out of World War One, which was coming very soon. Um, he became president in 1912, and World War One began in 1914. Woodrow Wilson did everything he could to stay out of that. We'll get more into that in the next chapter of this class today. Again, this last slide is of Upton Sinclair, who wrote The Jungle, which is in the textbook, reference to the absolutely disgusting conditions in meatpacking plants. And his book revealed this to millions of Americans and really revolutionized food handling, food preparation, and really in many ways began a profession of a more professional, trained type of food worker and cook and chef and food handling procedures, um, and made it more healthy and scientific and safe. And so his book had tremendous impact at the time. Okay, so that's the progressives. Be a good idea to after seeing this review, to write a paragraph or two on some of the major points of this review of chapter 23, and turn that in as a part of this week's class